You have been reading this story wrong your entire life. Not partially wrong, not missing a few nuances, completely, fundamentally, structurally wrong, in a way that was designed to make sure you never understood what it was actually saying. The story of Cain and Abel is not about a murder. It was never about a murder. The murder is the last line. Everything that matters happens before it, in a psychological territory so precise, so accurate to your inner life, that when you finally see it, you are going to feel it in your chest before you finish processing it in your mind. This is not a sermon. This is not theology. What you are about to encounter is the oldest map of internal conflict ever committed to writing, and for the first time, you're going to read it in the language it was actually written in. Stop for a moment and consider what it means that this is one of the most famous stories in human history. Billions of people know it. Billions. And yet the central question it raises, the only question that matters, has gone unanswered for centuries. Why did Cain kill Abel? Not the surface answer, not jealousy or anger. The real answer, the psychological answer. The answer that explains not just what happened in that field 4,000 years ago in a story, but what is happening inside you right now, today, in the decisions you are already making without realizing it. That answer has been sitting in the original Hebrew text the entire time, hiding in plain sight, concealed not by encryption, but by something more powerful than any code, translation. Think about what happens every time a story passes through a translation. Every time a word is chosen, it eliminates 50 other words. Every time a concept is simplified for a new audience, some layer of the original is peeled away and discarded. And in the case of the Hebrew Bible, this was not always an innocent process. Sometimes the peeling was intentional. Sometimes the simplification served power. There are people who have known for centuries that these stories are not what they appear to be. Scholars, mystics, psychologists, people who read the original Hebrew and came away changed. Not religiously changed, but psychologically changed. People who understood that what the ancient writers were mapping was not history. It was the architecture of the human mind. Here is what you have been told. Cain and Abel were two brothers. Cain killed Abel because God rejected Cain's offering and accepted Abel's. End of story. Moral: don't murder your brother. Don't let jealousy win. Here is what was actually written, a precise, terrifying, and compassionately brutal description of what happens when two fundamental modes of human consciousness go to war inside a single person, and what is lost when one of them wins. That is not the same story, not even close. And here is what you need to understand before we go any further. The people who shaped how this text was read and transmitted for centuries, the councils, the institutions, the theological bureaucracies, they were not primarily interested in what the text meant. They were interested in what the text could be made to do. There is a difference, a profound difference. One serves truth, the other serves structure. One liberates, the other controls. The earliest Christian thinkers, the ones who came before the institutional consolidation of the church, read these texts very differently. Origen of Alexandria, writing in the 3rd century, argued that the entire Genesis narrative was not meant to be read literally at all. He was explicit about it. He said that anyone reading these stories as historical facts was missing the point entirely, that the real meaning was interior, psychological, spiritual, in the deepest sense of that word. Origen was eventually condemned by the Second Council of Constantinople in 553 CE. His books were burned. His ideas were labeled heretical, not because they were wrong, but because if he was right, the church didn't need to be the intermediary between you and what the text was saying. You could read it yourself. You could understand it yourself. And that was a problem. Philo of Alexandria, writing even earlier, in the 1st century, was saying almost identical things. Philo was a Jewish philosopher who read the Torah through the lens of Greek philosophy and psychology. He explicitly argued that the stories in Genesis were not accounts of external events, but maps of the soul's interior landscape. He used the word psyche, the Greek word for soul or mind, to describe the characters. He said Cain and Abel were not brothers in the historical sense. They were principles, forces, modes of being. Nobody tells you that in Sunday school. Remember what I said at the beginning, that this was hidden on purpose. This is exactly what I meant. If what you are hearing right now is starting to crack something open in you, if you're already seeing these stories differently, stay with this channel. Every video goes one layer deeper, and the next layer always changes more than the last. Now let's go into the text. And this is where everything begins to shift. The name Cain in Hebrew is Qayin. This is not a proper name in the way we understand proper names. In ancient Hebrew, names carry meaning. They are more like titles or descriptions than identifiers. Qayin comes from the root kana, which means to acquire, to possess, to take hold of something, to claim ownership. It is the same root used in the phrase, "I have acquired a man," the words Eve speaks when Cain is born. Think about that. The mind of acquisition, the consciousness that defines itself by what it can take, claim, possess, and accumulate. The self that says, "I exist because I own. I exist because I have produced. I exist because I can point to something external and say, that is mine." That is Qayin. That is Cain. Now Abel, in Hebrew, Hevel, and this is where the translators really failed you. Hevel is not a name. Hevel is a word. It means breath, vapor. That which is fleeting, present, alive, and then gone. It is the same word the book of Ecclesiastes opens with, Hevel Havelim, translated as vanity of vanities, but the real meaning is closer to breath of breaths, presence of presences, the sheer aliveness of being alive in this moment without grasping at it. Hevel is the consciousness that simply is, present, open, not acquiring, not producing, just being in direct contact with existence. Now stop. You are not reading about two brothers anymore. You are reading about two ways of existing in the world that live inside every single human being who has ever been born. One of them is oriented toward acquisition, productivity, output, and self-definition through what it can make and claim. The other is oriented toward presence, aliveness, receptivity, and direct contact with reality, without needing to own it. And here is what the neuroscience says. Ian McGilchrist spent decades studying the divided brain, not the pop psychology version of left brain versus right brain, not creativity versus logic. The actual, documented, peer-reviewed difference in how the two hemispheres of the human brain relate to reality. And what he found was extraordinary. The left hemisphere, McGilchrist argues, is oriented toward what he calls the represented world, the world of categories, tools, abstractions, possession, and control. It needs to take a living thing, freeze it, label it, and use it. It is the hemisphere of acquisition, of saying, what can I do with this? What is this for? How do I extract value from it? It is the hemisphere that generates the self as a project, the self that must constantly prove its worth through output, achievement, and accumulation. The right hemisphere, by contrast, is oriented toward the living world as it actually is, fluid, relational, present, and impossible to fully possess or reduce to categories. It is the hemisphere of aliveness, of direct contact, of being moved by something without needing to own it. It is the hemisphere that recognizes another person as genuinely other, as genuinely alive, as irreducible to a function or a use. McGilchrist calls the dominance of the left hemisphere over the right one of the central crises of our civilization. He wrote an entire book about it, The Master and His Emissary. He argued that we have built a world that systematically suppresses the right hemisphere's mode of knowing and amplifies the left hemisphere's mode until it becomes the only mode, until we cannot even imagine what the other feels like. Cain and Hevel, the acquiring mind and the breath of being, written in Hebrew thousands of years ago, confirmed in neuroscience in the 21st century. This is not a coincidence. This is a result. But wait, because there is something in the story that almost no one notices, something that changes everything about who you think God is in this narrative, and by extension, who you think is judging you. The text says that God accepted Abel's offering and rejected Cain's, and every reading you have ever encountered treats this as God being arbitrary or capricious or playing favorites. And that reading has caused enormous theological damage, centuries of people believing in a God who accepts some and rejects others based on criteria nobody fully understands. But look at the Hebrew. The word for offering here is mincha. It means a gift, a tribute, something brought in acknowledgement of something greater than yourself. And Abel's mincha is described as brought from the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions, which in ancient Hebrew idiom means the best of what is, offered from a place of genuine presence. The text says, God looked upon Abel's offering. The Hebrew word is shah, to gaze, to regard with attention, to be present to. Cain's offering, by contrast, is described simply as the fruit of the ground. No further description, no sense of presence or quality. The rabbinic tradition comments extensively on this. Cain brought what was convenient. He brought what was left over. He brought his output without any genuine offering of self. Now here is what this means psychologically. The difference between the two offerings is not about the content. It is about the mode of consciousness from which they were made. One is an act of genuine presence. The other is a transaction. One is Hevel. One is Qayin. And what the story is saying is that reality, life itself, responds differently to these two modes, not because it is playing favorites, but because only one of them is actually making contact with reality. Only one of them is actually there. Antonio Damasio, one of the most important neuroscientists alive, has spent his career showing that emotion and reason are not separate systems, but deeply integrated ones, and that consciousness itself depends on the body's ability to be present to what is actually happening. His research shows that people with damage to the emotional and somatic systems of the brain become unable to make good decisions despite having intact logical faculties. They lose what Damasio calls the somatic marker, the felt sense of what matters. They become, in a word, pure Qayin, pure acquisition without presence, and their lives collapse. This is what the text is describing. The rejection of Cain's offering is not God being unfair. It is the description of what happens when the acquiring mind brings its output to life and life doesn't respond, because life cannot respond to a transaction. Life responds to presence. Always. Think about that for a moment. If something just shifted in you right now, if this is landing differently than anything you have heard before, drop "I'm awake" in the comments and tell me what city you are watching from, because people are arriving at this same moment right now across the world, in Sao Paulo and Lagos, in London and Manila, in Cairo and Los Angeles. And I want to see exactly where this is happening. Now, here is where the story becomes dangerous. Because after Cain's offering is rejected, something happens that the text describes with extraordinary precision. God speaks to Cain, and what God says is one of the most psychologically sophisticated passages in all of ancient literature. Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? If you do good, will you not be lifted up? And if you do not do good, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. This translation is close enough for now. But the word translated as sin here is the Hebrew word chata, which more precisely means missing the mark, deviation, going off course. And the phrase crouching at the door uses the word rovetz, which is also used to describe an animal in a resting predatory posture, not attacking, waiting. And then there is the word translated as desire, the Hebrew word teshuka, the same word used to describe desire in the Song of Songs, not a neutral word, not a clinical word, an intensely relational word, a word that means this thing is oriented toward you, this thing is leaning into you with all of its weight. What God is saying to Cain, to the acquiring mind, is this: you have not yet destroyed anything. The deviation is waiting. It is patient. It is at the door, and its entire orientation is toward you. But you are not yet lost. You still have the capacity to master it. Notice what does not happen in this passage. God does not reject Cain. God does not abandon Cain. God speaks to Cain, directly, personally, with warning and with possibility. And Cain does not respond. The text, immediately and with devastating terseness, says, Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. He doesn't respond to God. He doesn't wrestle with the warning. He doesn't sit with the question. He turns. He acts. And Hevel, breath, presence, the aliveness of being, disappears from the story. Now here is where Carl Jung enters this room, because Jung spent decades trying to articulate something that the Hebrew writers had already articulated thousands of years earlier in 3 Hebrew names. Jung called it the shadow, the part of the psyche that the conscious ego refuses to acknowledge, refuses to integrate, and therefore refuses to take responsibility for. The shadow is not the same as evil. The shadow is the repository of everything we have disowned, everything about ourselves that threatens the self-image we have constructed. And Jung said something that should stop you cold. The shadow does not disappear when you refuse to see it. It gains power, it accumulates, it waits at the door. And eventually it acts, often through us, often against the very things we claim to love. Cain is not a villain. Cain is a person who refused to see what was crouching at his door, who refused to integrate the warning, who took the internal war, the war between acquisition and presence, between transaction and aliveness. And instead of fighting it internally, externalized it. He turned the war outward. And the casualty of that externalization was the only thing in him that was actually alive. This is the pattern. And you have lived some version of it. Have you ever been in a moment of genuine presence, a real conversation, a creative flow state, a moment of actual contact with another person or with your own life, and then felt something in you pull away from it? Some voice that said, "This isn't productive, this doesn't count, what are you doing? You should be working, you should be achieving something, you should be building something, you should be getting somewhere." That voice is Qayin, inside you, right now. And every time that voice wins, something in you goes quiet. Something that was breathing stops breathing. The Hevel in you, the capacity for direct presence, for aliveness without justification, for being instead of only doing, gets a little smaller, a little further away, a little harder to find. This is it. This is the whole pattern. And it gets worse. Because this is not just an internal phenomenon. This is a social one. Qayin consciousness does not stay inside. It metastasizes. It shapes systems. It builds cultures. Look at what the text says happens after the murder. And I mean, look carefully, because this is the part everyone skips. After killing Abel, Cain goes on to build a city, the first city in the biblical narrative. And he names it after his son, Enoch, which means dedicated, established, founded. Cain builds a civilization. He builds structures. He builds systems of production and accumulation. And his descendants, listed explicitly in the text, become the originators of music, metallurgy, and agriculture. They build the tools of civilization. And Abel? Abel has no descendants. Abel leaves no structures. Abel builds nothing in the text's account. Now stop. Because the temptation here is to read this as Cain winning, as acquisition triumphing over presence. And on the surface level, that is exactly what it looks like. The world we live in is Cain's city. It is optimized for output, for accumulation, for measurable productivity, for exactly the kind of consciousness that cannot sit with an offering that doesn't transact. But here is what the text does that is psychologically brilliant. It does not end there. The story of Cain and Abel ends, but the Bible does not. And what comes next, very quickly, is the flood, the reset, the dissolution of everything Cain built, not because God is vindictive, but because a civilization built entirely on the acquiring mode, with no Hevel left in it, with no presence, no aliveness, no contact with what is actually real, is a civilization that is already dying from the inside. The flood is not punishment. The flood is diagnosis. We will go much deeper into that in the next video, but hold that image. Now look at your own life, right now. Not abstractly, specifically. Where in your life is the acquiring mind running the show completely? Where have you built a system, a routine, a relationship pattern, a career structure that is entirely oriented around output and validation and accumulation, with no genuine presence inside it? Where have you been so focused on getting somewhere that you have stopped actually being anywhere? Joseph Campbell, writing about the hero's journey, identified what he called the threshold guardian, the force at the edge of the known world that must be confronted before any genuine transformation can occur. And he said something that maps perfectly onto this story. The guardian is never truly defeated by force. It is only defeated by recognition, by the hero turning to face it, by naming it, by integrating it rather than destroying it. God told Cain to rule over what was crouching at the door, not to kill it, not to suppress it, not to exile it, to master it, which in the Hebrew and Greek psychological tradition means to consciously integrate it, to take responsibility for it, to bring it into right relationship with the rest of who you are. Cain did not do that. Cain turned away from the internal confrontation and made it external. He went into the field, and the field in Hebrew, Sadesh, specifically means open country, unstructured space, the space outside the ordered world. And in that unstructured space, he eliminated the only voice in him that was capable of presence. And here is the confrontation I want to leave you standing in, because this is the moment in the video where it becomes personal and it becomes permanent. You have a Qayin in you. You know exactly who it is. It is the part of you that cannot rest. The part that turns every moment of quiet into a list. The part that, when something good happens, immediately begins calculating how to leverage it. The part that looks at a relationship and asks, what is this for? The part that wakes up at 3 a.m., not because something is wrong, but because it cannot stop acquiring. Not money, not necessarily, but validation, certainty, control, the feeling of being enough because of what it can produce. And you have a Hevel in you. You know exactly who that is, too. It is the part of you that actually feels things. The part that stops on a walk because something is beautiful. The part that can sit with another person and actually be there, not performing being there. The part that, when it creates something, does not immediately ask whether it worked. The part that knows, without being able to prove it, that you are already enough, not because of anything you have done, but because you are breathing, because you are here. And the war between them is not abstract. It is happening right now, in the decisions you will make today, in how you respond to this video, in whether you close your laptop after this and immediately move on to something productive, or whether you sit for 5 minutes in the uncomfortable, alive, unacquisitive space of actually thinking about what you just heard. The ancient writers who composed this text were not writing about two men in a field. They were writing about the oldest war in human experience, the war between what you are and what you think you need to become to be acceptable, between presence and performance, between aliveness and output, between Hevel and Qayin, and they were warning you, specifically. Across 4,000 years of silence and translation and institutional management of meaning, they were sending you a message wrapped in a story about two brothers, knowing that if the message survived, even partially, even obscured, someone would eventually be ready to receive it. You are receiving it now, and now you see it. This is what I said at the beginning, that you have been reading this story wrong. Not partially wrong, completely wrong. And now you know why. Not because you lacked intelligence, but because you were given a translation that stripped the story of its psychology and left you with a moral about jealousy. A moral you could absorb in 30 seconds and then set aside. A moral that would never change anything in you. Because that is how you make a map harmless. You reduce it to a warning label and make sure no one looks at the territory. The territory is your mind. The map is the story. And the story has been accurate this entire time. The acquiring mind and the breath of presence, left hemisphere dominance and right hemisphere receptivity, the shadow and the living self. Cayenne and Hevel. Different languages, different centuries, different frameworks, all pointing at the same interior geography, all describing the same war, all asking you the same question. Which one are you going to send into the field tomorrow? And when we come back to this, because we are coming back to this, it is going to make sense in a way you are not expecting. Because the next chapter of this story is not the murder. The murder is over. The next chapter is what God says to Cain after. What the mark of Cain actually is, not a curse, not a brand of shame. Something far stranger, far more merciful, and far more psychologically precise than anything you have been told. That brings us directly to where we go next, because in the next video, we go inside the mark itself. What is the mark on Cain? Not a punishment, not a stigma. This was a statement about the psychology of the exiled, acquiring mind. What happens to a consciousness that has permanently destroyed its own capacity for presence, and what, if anything, can bring it back? And that question is still being asked right now. To you, in the life you are currently living, the next chapter is already waiting, and once you see it, you don't go back.